So I'm back again to talk about more of my childhood years. This time dealing with some fairly dark subject matter it's a little hard for me to talk about and bring up. So bear with me. Where this starts is when I was about 10 years old in 5th grade. We were living in a town in East Texas. I had been going to the same school for most of my grade school years, so I had developed, a fairly large group of friends, acquaintances. I was fairly bright. I did well. I was kind of free to be who I thought I was, and I didn't have any kind of social pressures or peer pressures develop at that point. But at the end of the 5th grade year, I got word from my parents that we were moving. I didn't much like it, but at that time in your life, you kind of do what your parents tell you to do. I didn't have the resources yet to argue against it or even have a leg up in the conversation, so I kind of went. But there was kind of this underlying notion that I was dimly aware of, that my dad was starting a different career, and he was starting at a much lower level pay rate wise. So we kind of took a dive into sort of a lower middle class level, where, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but it was a little new to us at that time. So we moved into this fairly recent, kind of developing neighborhood on the outskirts of town, and we moved into a double-wide mobile home there. My family and I was, at that time, it was 2 of my younger brothers, myself, and my parents. And I was made aware of the school I was getting ready to go to. That summer, prior to the school year of 6th grade, I had a couple run-ins with some neighborhood kids. Nothing big, but just, some, who are you moving to my neighborhood kind of things. But it was a little ominous and foreboding for what the school year would hold. So I entered 6th grade, and the school was much different than I was accustomed. It was home to mostly sort of the rougher sides of town. So there were a lot of rough kids in the school. And, coming from the same sort of lower class to lower middle class families. And almost from the get-go, I had developed a pretty rocky relationship with what was considered to be sort of the toughest kid in my class. And through no fault of my own, it wasn't a conscious thing, but because of that, starting out on that foot, he decided that he would put his foot down, and I was the example. And he started bullying me, picking on me, making fun of me, and of course the class sided with him for the most part because of who he was. And I was totally isolated in the beginning. So I was a very sensitive kid, and I didn't have much knowledge of how to stick up for myself. I didn't have the inner spirit that I kicked myself all the time for not having. My dad wasn't around much when I was younger, so I didn't have a good father role model in which to deal with that kind of situation. So all I knew is that I wanted to be liked, and I wanted to be included, and I just wanted everyone to get along. But that just wasn't to be. That whole year was fraught basically with the same thing. And ironically, there was a movie that came out around the same time called The Lords of Flatbush. I believe it was Sylvester Stallone's first movie before his Rocky fame. And it kind of presented the idea of these gangs in New York. And these gangs were sort of these kind of street thug groups of 4 to 5, guys, in leather jackets, this kind of thing. And it infiltrated its way within the minds of my peers, and so thereby it was no longer just between me and this kid that I was talking about. His name was Jimmy Crank at the time. But they would form gangs of 4 or 5 kids that now would, do these picking on me and sort of, doing these things. So, and this wasn't just your basic just picking on and verbal abuse. This went on, where I was forced to humiliate myself in front of my other peers, in front of girls. And I was going through puberty at this time, so, my interest in girls had skyrocketed anyway, so it was, the humiliation was just amplified. And that went with, other things as well that you tend to sort of, music and the idea of rebellion, all these things kind of played their part in this. I was shunned from the group if I got good grades or had any sort of achievements that shined, over and above the other kids. So I purposely got bad grades, purposely sort of shun any kind of spotlight to avoid becoming, the butt of that joke or the end of the bullying stick, on any given day. And then, all this stuff really had its repercussions at home too, because not only did I, because of this loss of control, almost total loss of control, and sort of development of self-hatred that I had, because I couldn't take up for myself, I would turn around on my own brothers, because they were younger than me. Of course, I knew I had the upper hand, and I picked on them incessantly. And to this day, I still deal with the guilt from that, and I've apologized to them and I've acknowledged it before, but it's still hard to deal with that I did that. I tried to reach out to my parents at a certain point, because one of the other sort of activities the bullies did on a daily basis was steal whatever they wanted from my lunch and the lunch of the other kids they picked on. So any kind of dessert or, good thing that I would get in my lunch, one of the bullies would call it out, say, well, that's Bedinghauses is that's mine. So when I informed my mom of this, I can't remember if I told both parents at the same time. I think just my mother at first. The response I got was that of being upset at me for letting it happen. Or being upset because I was wasting their money. And there was never a sense of trying to pull me aside and saying, why is this happening? What can we do to make this better? Can we, what do you need to know? And my father, even when he got wind of it, got upset with me because, it's not the way he would ever deal with things. So he couldn't understand at all why some young boy would let that happen. And so that fed the self-hatred even more, because I was letting down, the only father figure I knew at the time. So I didn't know how to stick up for myself, and he didn't teach me how. He would provide examples for what he did as a kid, but it didn't seem to it didn't translate. It wasn't like I could just do that myself. I needed something else, and what they provided at the time wasn't it. The only, I guess, good thing that happened during this grade, or this time, was that this is when I discovered the guitar, and it sort of became my safe haven and my sanctuary. The bad thing about that was that I would isolate myself with the guitar once I started playing it, and avoid further social interactions. So I never really developed a solid basis for, good social interactions, which has played its part in many things that have gone wrong in my life to this day, and I'm still dealing with. So it was good. It gave me something to focus on, something to believe in, something to sort of escape from. But I escaped in a way that I just didn't deal with things very well. But the fact that I discovered it at all was a good thing, because those achievements that I got from that later on helped to pull me up somewhat out of the sort of this hell that I had gotten myself in. So 7th grade rolls around, and it's more of the same. But then about the middle of that year, I get another word from my parents that we are moving again. And it's not so far a move. I was grateful for the move, to be honest, but at that point, I was now scared or fearful of what I was getting myself into with another school. Because at that point, I had been brainwashed so severely by these bullies that I really only knew how to deal with people in certain ways and view social interactions in certain ways. One of those was with boys. It was all about who was toughest, It was all an animal sort of instinct thing. Who was highest on the hierarchical ladder? Where were you on that ladder? So my first questions going in the new school was, who's the toughest kid? How can I size them up, against what I might be able to offer? And with girls, it was the only way I knew how to interact with them at this point was in a sexual way, not in having sex, but in just viewing them through the viewpoint or the lens of sexuality, and not in just developing friendships, talking normal social interaction. So, going into the new school, I really had a deformed sense of how to introduce myself. Thankfully, the people at that school were of a much different caliber, and it wasn't long till I developed, some friends and started to kind of get out of gloss over sort of what had gone on prior. I say gloss over because that was only the beginning of sort of the confusion that all that brainwashing from bullying caused, and the repercussions throughout my life that I would deal with. At any rate, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this and focus on this particular time because of the issues of bullying. Just one other point, for those people that would say, well, why didn't you reach out and tell somebody, a teacher, anything? A couple reasons. I had a teacher, only one teacher, reach out, and he kind of he saw what was going on, and he took me aside and sort of offered to invited me to, kind of spill the beans on what was going on and admit that there was a problem. But had I done that, I knew what the repercussions of that were. I knew that he would eventually talk to those boys or the parents or school administration, and I would get the blunt end of the stick on that, because they would come back and it would make it tougher to deal with because I got them in trouble. I brought the issue to light. So I just went on my way and said, no, there was no problem. I reached out to my parents. Of course, they didn't handle it well either. And so my only escape was inward, and just trying to suffer through it the best I could. So really, I bring that up because when people talk about bullying today, and I see kids that go as far as committing suicide because of the effects of it, I understand. I get why it happens. And I sort of loathe when people, act disgusted or, horrified that could have happened. How could anybody get to the point where they do that? But, why don't they just reach out? Well, they can't in most instances for the same reasons: social repercussions and the real inability for anybody to help. And that's what I did. To this day, I often sort of theorize that had I had any more courage at that time, I might have tried to end my own life also. Thankfully, I didn't. But I didn't out of fear, not and lack of courage. And so sometimes when I see people take that route, I think that even though it's terrible and you never know what your life could become, they had the courage to deal with it some way. Although I do not think that is the way, just to reiterate. Had I done that, I would never have gone through the journey in life I've gone through. I would have never had my kids, which are the most important things in my life. So, at any rate, we'll continue this next time. Thanks for listening.